All right, every week at this time, if we can help it, Frank Gaffney joins us, Executive Director of the Center for Security Policy. Executive Chairman, Center for Security Policy, Vice President of the Committee on the Present Danger China, presentdangerchina.org, securefreedom.org, counterjihad.com. He also does Secure Freedom Radio. Frank, it's great to have you back. Let's start with China, and it looks like finally people are getting hip to the intellectual property theft and their control over rare earths, which we've been covering at Breitbart since, got to be 2012. It's got to be a good 6 or 7 years. That this is a huge strategic vulnerability for us, and finally, it seems like this week it's made it into the establishment media, and you have to be suspicious why people remained willfully ignorant of this for so long. Talk to us a little bit about this topic and why this is such a crucial vulnerability.
Well, it's symptomatic, really, Alex, of a larger problem, which is that on a whole host of issues in our supply chains, we have become dependent critically on the Chinese for things we can't, in some cases, literally live without. In addition to this business of these minerals, which are now used extensively in a whole host of, advanced electronic technologies in particular, these rare earth minerals. A gal by the name of Rosemary Gibson has done a chilling book called China RX. I'm sure you've talked with her. If you haven't, you need to, about our dependency upon China for antibiotics and penicillin and vitamin C, even, for heaven's sakes. These are things that are, essential to the well-being of a lot of Americans. And when you think about it, not only is there the danger that, as we're now being told, the Chinese may simply cut us off from access to things like these rare earth minerals, there's also the distinct possibility that what we'll be putting into our bodies for health purposes are actually poisonous because they allow contaminants in. If it's not deliberate, it's malfeasant. But whatever is going on, it is ill-advised in the extreme for the United States of America to be dependent for commercial reasons, for public safety reasons, to say nothing of national security reasons, on supply lines that emanate from communist China.
Yeah, so important here. So, Frank, do you have a sense of the trade war, how it's playing in China in particular? Because we have such limited information of China as we talk about time and again, but it seems like all the indicators that we're getting are that they're suffering a little bit from the current pressure this administration is putting on the Chinese government.
Yeah, I don't think there's any question that's happening. There's decidedly a slowdown taking place in the Chinese economy. But here's the thing, Alex. I think the president deserves great credit for having really understood the nature of the challenge we're facing now from China. He's actually called it, in a recent executive order, at least by inference, a foreign adversary. And why I think this is so signal is he needs to be not only maintaining the pressure for a really great trade deal, but there are other things that we could be doing that could dramatically intensify the pressure on the Chinese to stop what has been described by some of their own military leaders as unrestricted warfare that they've been waging against us since, well, at least the early 2000s, if not well before that. Deng Xiaoping reportedly said the Cold War is over between the United States and the Soviet Union. The Soviets lost. There's a new Cold War beginning, and we will win this one between the United States and China. But here's the point. There has been some terrific work done by my colleague Roger Robinson. He's addressed our Committee on the Present Danger China several times. People can see his videos at presentdangerchina.org. What Roger's pointed out is, quite apart from the trade pressure, the tariffs that the president's brought to bear, we could do immense course correcting on the part of the Chinese if we stopped underwriting through their access to our capital markets on very preferential terms. For example, get this, the Chinese companies that are coming to the U.S. stock market, for example, or other Western capital markets for that matter, are given a pass on having to conform to the same transparency and accountability requirements as American companies. What is wrong with that picture, especially, Alex, when some of those companies are doing things like helping the Chinese mount this unbelievably oppressive surveillance state? A company like Hikvision, for example, millions of cameras across China, including those that are being used to oppress the Uyghurs out in Western China. This is crazy, and we need, the common practice for American companies to apply to Chinese as well. That would dry up a lot of the money that they're getting from our capital markets. That, in turn, would intensify the pressure on China for real change. That's what we need.
Yeah, that's right. And so let's talk about some of the art of the deal that's going on, which used to be known as diplomacy or negotiation, but I think it's fun to say the art of the deal. I think it trolls the right people because there's a lot of moves I think that this White House is making, sort of portray a lot of good cop, bad cop going on. One thing that is the bad cop is without a doubt John Bolton, your friend of mine, and China's furious with him because he had met with a Taiwanese official. China has this thing called the One China policy, which I think we kind of play along with here in the United States. Refresh us on that and why it's so triggering for the Chinese when the ambassador meets with a Taiwanese official.
Well, it's one of the real blemishes, shall we say, black marks on American foreign policy that
I agree with you.
Now for decades, successive U.S. governments, I think initially Jimmy Carter's, but it's alternated back and forth with Republican ones too, have honored this idea that Taiwan is really part of China. And there's only one China, and it's been our policy that it's up to them to sort it out, the Chinese on the mainland and the Chinese on Taiwan. When in fact, Alex, it's been evident for years, certainly for the past decade or two, that the people of Taiwan consider them people of Taiwan themselves, and they're a free and democratic and sovereign nation that is an important ally of ours, by the way, against our common foreign adversary, namely Communist China. And what John Bolton has done by meeting with his counterpart has pissed the Chinese off, yes, to be sure, but it is an important sign that the Trump administration, as in these other areas we were just talking about, is deciding to go a different way with respect to China. I don't know that they formally have departed from this one China thing, but the practical effect of recognizing and helping support the sovereignty and the security of Taiwan is in our vital interests. And it needs to be done both in these sort of symbolic diplomatic ways, as well as providing them the wherewithal they need to defend their people.
Very good. Frank Gaffney again is my guest. Frank, let's talk a little bit about China pushing back against international isolation by promoting big data cooperation. Report on this at Breitbart News, but I want to hear it from you. This is this is exciting stuff. Tell me about it.
Well, it's, I think, frightening stuff, frankly. I believe what we're confronting increasingly, Alex, we see it in this so-called 5G, the fifth generation wireless business. We see it in some of that stuff I was just talking about, the surveillance state. What China is doing to access and then to manipulate and otherwise utilize for oppression their big data that can be collected by cameras or facial recognition or wireless, surveillance, what have you. These are the sorts of things that in the hands of totalitarians like the Chinese Communist Party are formula for grave repression at home. But they're also intent on exporting it elsewhere. I think of it as sort of digital imperialism.
Yes.
And it's part and parcel of what they're doing with this Belt and Road Initiative is to build out the infrastructure that will enable them with 5G and other techniques to help other totalitarians enslave their people, all ultimately for the benefit of the Chinese Communist Party. It's very frightening indeed.
So let me ask you something, Frank, because reading the China Daily, which is a Chinese paper, so obviously there's this nothing runs in China unless the government is okay with it. They were very excited to report that by 2025, China will have gone up from this year or last year where they collected 23% of of the world's data to 28% in 2025. They're bragging about that, and they're heckling the United States, who is at this rate will be dropping from 21% last year to 17.5% by 2025, which to me sounds like a good thing. Sounds like a little more freedom, and the Chinese a little more totalitarian. And as we talk about on the show so often, the Chinese running a surveillance state, all totalitarians will do this because that's what it means to be a totalitarian. And we want to get away from that as much as possible. But am I misreading it? Is this something that is a strategic vulnerability for us as they collect more and more data and we don't?
Well, I can't speak to the data that we collect, but I can tell you the difference between what we do with it and what they do with it is, as Mark Twain used to say, the difference between lightning and lightning bugs. You're talking about people who will control and manipulate and weaponize that data. I mean, think about this, Alex. Just one example. The Internet of Things, as it's called, as you know, is going to, once 5G is put into place, these networks to enable the migration of immense amount of data to control every aspect of your life, basically. I mean, all of your appliances, your self-driving vehicles, your use of the internet and so on. These are things that I believe will be, to say nothing of our electric grid, will be in the hands of people who control that network. And if that's the Chinese communists, as it is going to be in large parts of the world, not only, of course, in China, but in South Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, in Europe, and probably in parts of the United States, despite what President Trump has just issued in an executive order saying, not here. These are the sorts of things that can enable not only somebody else to decide what's going to be done with your appliances, let's say, or your self-driving car, but they can actually weaponize them against us. I mean, literally, you could have that self-driving car self-drive into, a lamppost and kill you. You could have the grid taken down. You could have, you think about the other kinds of techniques that would be used to, for example, have your phone irradiate you, your 5G phone. I mean, these are the sorts of things we cannot possibly entrust to people hostile to our nation. And it's much more than just the percentage of data. It's the use they'll be making of them against us.
Yeah, very good point. Frank Gaffney, let's talk about a couple other issues around the world. What's your reaction to the EU elections, which saw, first of all, pretty dominant performance by the nationalist populist parties, but also a rise of the green hysterical climate change parties as well. Do you have a reaction to this? And more importantly, what do you think this means for geopolitics?
Well, I think it was not a good day for the globalists, though the left will default to more globalist impulses, of course, to enforce climate change and other of their taboos and mandates. These are the sorts of things that I think we should be worried about. But it is heartening, and I want to salute our mutual friend Steve Bannon for the work that he was doing over there to try to help those nationalists, those populists, if you will, those people determined to preserve the sovereignty of their nations against these globalists, to both adopt, best practices and make considerable inroads into the European Parliament. What remains to be seen, of course, is will that matter very much? Because the European Parliament is mostly a symbolic venue. More interesting will be, of course, what happens as a result of the Brexit party in the UK doing so well in the internal politics of Britain, which of course are going to be sorted out here over the next 2 weeks, I suppose. So watch this space, I guess, is the basic point, Alex. It's heartening that people across Europe don't want more of the same, don't want the establishment right and the establishment left driving them inexorably into the maw of the Eurocrats, as they're called, and the unrepresentative, sovereignty-sapping governance system of Europe. But I'm troubled by the rise of the left's environmentalist parties, because they're every bit as I think fascistic, really, as are the mainstream establishment types.
Okay, let's go to Iran, and this is another one where it's hard to get clarity on where we stand on this issue. You have to like that this administration is being infinitely tougher on Iran than the Obama-Biden administration, who enabled the Iranian regime that is the biggest state sponsor of terrorism on the planet, Islamic terrorism in particular. But what do we know about this one? Because it does seem like a lot of the reports are that there's even tensions within the president's ranks in terms of their policy, though it does seem like, by and large, they're being tough, but that's not a very articulate way to describe it, Frank. So give me your perspective.
Alex, it can't be said often enough that the people that we're dealing with in the government of Iran have, for 40 years, incessantly described their policy as death to America.
That's right.
And we talk about terrorism, and we talk about, their regional hegemonism, and we talk about, their attacks on the Jews or threats to Israel and the like. But at the end of the day, this is a regime that is absolutely in its DNA hostile to this country and anxious to do it harm. So I think what the Trump administration deserves great credit for is having a policy that reflects that reality, as opposed to enabling those threats, as Barack Obama infamously did with his Iran nuclear deal, and so many of his other policies, and that John Kerry, by the way, is still actively promoting in his sort of freelance diplomacy role. These are the sorts of policies that I think the American people repudiated at the polls in 2016, and President Trump deserves great credit for doing what he said he would do, which is to rip up that deal, to reimpose sanctions, and to squeeze this regime in such a way as I hope will enable the Iranian people at long last to rid themselves and us of this threat, which we share.
Yeah, very, very important that we continue to be diligent on this front. Last topic for today. Oh, actually, I have two more. Ramadan is here, which means a rise in violence. We've been through this, Frank, every year, I think, you and I, but it's important to remind folks who are new to the show. And we also are in that free listening event right now. So if you have friends who have a Sirius XM device, they're all on at the moment, whether or not you're current on your subscription. So, and if you are listening and you don't subscribe, you can get the Sirius XM Essential Package right now. It's $1 a month for the first 3 months and $8 a month after that. This interview alone with Frank should be worth your $8. So I don't. It's a great deal. I don't know why you'd miss it. But casualties are over 1,000 in the third week of Ramadan. Why is there such a rash of terrorism during this holiest month on the Muslim calendar?
Well, I don't know about you, Alex, but I get pretty cranky when I don't have something to eat for a couple of hours, let alone, a full day. And I think, unfortunately, the trouble with this practice is that it essentially creates an awful lot of people who are susceptible to anger management issues, shall we call it. And especially when it's coupled with the rest of the Sharia doctrine, which is supremacist in character, violence, jihad, advancing the interests of Islam through those sorts of techniques is something that people, when they're starving, I believe, are more prone to doing. And so, yes, you're seeing these statistics, and I commend Breitbart for putting them in front of us. They're chilling. I mean, 25 people killed a day.
Yes.
In Ramadan is a pretty horrific thing, and they're by, again, people who are faithful to this creed of Sharia, I'm sorry to say.
It is, and I believe this is what our conclusion was last year, Frank. It is about being hangry, and I get hangry myself. That it is true, but it is. Look, I'm not trying to be dismissive of this. Also, this is very significant. It's very serious, but the show employs dark humor from time to time, Frank, as you know. But this is very disturbing. And is there a workaround, or is this something that just should be our reality forever?
Well, look, I'm not being dismissive or trying to make light of this. I'm simply saying that I think when you add a dose of doctrine to a human condition, you get certain predictable results. Look, The answer, I think, is to try to promote and encourage and empower Muslims who do not embrace this Sharia code, and that's where the real danger arises. I mean, hunger management and anger management are both issues, of course, but I think the big problem is where people are told jihad is good, kill people in advancing it is your divine mandate. That's a real problem, Alex.
All right. Ilhan Omar said she brings a perspective to U.S. foreign policy of a foreigner. I bring the perspective of a foreigner to U.S. foreign policy. First of all, Frank, what is she talking about? And second of all, why does she think that this is a benefit at this point in time? It shows you how pathetic the Democrats are. If she could even cross her mind that this is something that is productive for her to say. She thinks she's going to score points by announcing that she's basically like a foreigner influencing our foreign policy.
Well, speaking of Sharia supremacists, that is, of course, what she is. And you can tell that not only by her dress, but also by her willingness to do, for example, fundraising for organizations like the Council on American Islamic Relations, a Muslim Brotherhood front organization founded by Hamas, which, of course, is a designated terrorist organization. These are indicators of where her loyalties lie, I'm sorry to say, Alex. So in a way, it's refreshing that she's candidly acknowledging she considers herself a foreigner, but it's very troubling that her views are increasingly being condoned, if not actually embraced, by the Democratic Party. They're not foreigners. They profess to be proud Americans, and yet they are embracing what she is essentially carving out as the vanguard of hard left democratic foreign policy in this country, which is hostile to Israel. I believe it is hostile to many of our friends and allies and interests around the world, and frankly, I think it's pretty darn hostile to America as well.
It is hostile to America, and it's openly so. And will there be any condemnation? Will anyone speak out against this, Frank, or is it just talk radio fodder for me and you?
Well, I pray they will. I think the polls are going to show Democrats that this kind of attitude is not going to win them voters, but it may take an election for them to discover that. As a former Scoop Jackson Democrat decades ago, I can tell you I've bemoaned what's happened to one of America's two political parties, because we need bipartisan policies that understand where our interests lie, notably, but not exclusively, of course, but notably with the Jewish state of Israel, one of our most important allies in the world, certainly our most important one in the Middle East. She's dead set against it, and increasingly it seems an awful lot of other Democrats are as well. Scoop Jackson is spinning at a very high RPM in his grave. That fact.
Frank Gaffney, Executive Chairman of the Center for Security Policy, Vice Chairman of the Committee on the Present Danger China. You go to presentdangerchina.org, securefreedom.org, counterjihad.com. Check out Secure Freedom Radio. And Frank, we'll talk to you next week.
Bless you. Thank you, Alex.